Welcome and good evening. My name is Gerald, and I serve as Program Manager of the Common Ground Initiative in the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center, Gleaves Whitney and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, Brooke Clement and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, thank you for joining us for our celebration of this year's President's Day. We begin, as always, with a leadership minute from a student in the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy, followed by an introduction of this evening's esteemed speaker by Gleaves Whitney. From there, we will jump back 200 years to this day in history, February 18th, 1821, for a probing conversation with Mr. Thomas Jefferson. We will close with a question and answer session, so as questions come to mind, please use the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen to submit them. The connection between leadership and the study of history is well documented, in its proper context, while also enabling us to make more informed decisions for the future. Now, I'd like to turn it over to a student who practices the importance of informed leadership. Christopher Marco is a first-year student in the Leadership Academy studying political science, history, and vocal music. Please help me welcome to the screen, Christopher.
Good evening. My name is Christopher Marco, and I am a first-year Cook Leadership Academy Fellow Candidate and political science major at Grand Valley State University. In honor of President's Day being this week, I would like to share with you two quotes from past presidents that serve as a guide and inspiration in my own life. In 1963, John F. Kennedy told the American people, "I ask particularly that those of you who are now in school will prepare yourselves to bear the burden of leadership over the next 40 years here in the United States, and make sure that the United States, which I believe almost alone has maintained watch and ward for freedom, meet its responsibility." Though spoken nearly 60 years ago, this quote still holds relevance today. The term burden of leadership holds special weight for me and is a cornerstone of my own leadership philosophy. To me, leadership is not a luxury or reward. It is a sacrifice and service. Being a leader should not be and is not an easy job. Many people feel that the future of our country and our world currently hangs in the balance. In order to face the challenges of the times, the next generation of leaders, my generation, must prepare to assume this responsibility and burden of leadership. Herein lies the value and importance of the Cook Leadership Academy, equipping the next generation of leaders with the tools and confidence necessary to bring about positive and long-lasting change on a local, national, and global scale. Through the conversations and activities we students participate in at the Cook Leadership Academy, we work to develop our own unique visions, better understand ourselves in the diverse world in which we live, and strive to come together, united, in our hopes for a brighter future. My experience this year with the Cook Leadership Academy has left me filled with hope for this brighter future, as my peers in this body have displayed through their thoughtful conversations and ambitious goals that when the reins of leadership are passed into our hands, we shall not fail. And so I would like to leave you with my second presidential quote, spoken by George H.W. Bush. "I do not mistrust the future. I do not fear what is ahead, for our problems are large, but our heart is larger." My name is Christopher Marco, and I am a leader. I would now like to pass it over to our moderator for this evening and Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, Gleaves Whitney.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for that wonderful introduction, and good evening. Well, what better way to pursue happiness than to spend an hour or so with our dear friend, Thomas Jefferson? I invite our viewers to use the toolbar to start formulating the questions they will surely want to put to our special guest this evening. Now, I'm looking at today's date, February 18th, 1821, which means that our third president retired from office some 12 years ago. Since he left the president's house, the United States has fought her first declared war against the British. Lewis Cass has been appointed governor of the territory of Michigan, a territory, by the way, that Mr. Jefferson created in January of 1805. And Maine and Missouri have just recently entered the Union. Well, tonight's guest eschews aristocratic titles, so he will not find offense if we address him as Mr. Jefferson rather than President Jefferson, or any of the other titles for which he's been well known, and they have been legion. Vice President Jefferson in the Adams administration, Secretary Jefferson in Mr. Washington's cabinet, Ambassador or Minister Jefferson in France, Governor Jefferson in the War for Independence, and so forth. I mean, no disrespect when I pass over his enormously long list of accomplishments. But I just want to say, with Republican little r simplicity, that there are three accomplishments that mean the most to him. And I know this because Mr. Jefferson has shared in private correspondence with me that these three will be engraved on a 6-foot stone obelisk at his future gravesite on the mountaintop of Monticello. These three and not a word more. Author of the Declaration of American Independence, author of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and founder of the University of Virginia. Mr. Jefferson, welcome and thank you so much for joining us. It is my honor now to invite you to opine.
My friends and my dear friend, Mr. Gleaves Whitney, it is a distinct pleasure for me to have the opportunity to engage what I consider the greatest product our nation has to offer the rest of the world: imagination. This extraordinary vehicle of imagination. Very simply, if the mind of man can think of such a method of communication over so many, many miles, then working at it, he can make it a reality. I cannot help but think, from what I am told, that you are situate now in a small settlement up in Northwest Virginia, known as the Territory of Michigan, a settlement known as Grand Rapids, that by calculation, you are upwards of about 750 miles from where I now sit in Charlottesville. Do you know that it would take a good field trip to with your friend? I live in a former world. I know also Chelsea, or also I am able to live 40 miles a day, ride comfortably 5 miles an hour in the saddle. One can walk comfortably 3 miles an hour. So there you are, take the difference. A 4-mile-an-hour world. This is an extraordinary opportunity to be able to communicate, and particularly to share the founding principles of our nation with you all. And when I refer to sharing, it is distinctly with that interest to hear your questions and your curiosities. That is the greatest liberty and freedom we have, to hold an opinion freely and to express our opinions freely, an open and free forum. But citizens, firstly, I wanted to take time to provide, if you will, somewhat of a further context, a clarity in the distance that separates us. And curiously, by the way, I am told that I have but 20 minutes to provide such clarity before I receive your questions. Can you imagine allowing someone only 20 minutes to express themselves? Someone told me the other day, well, Mr. President, we only allow 2 minutes for the expression of an answer to any question put forth to a president. Well, I am not living in that world, rest you assured. But there are further similarities I would like to explain in an open and free inquiry, something that I have heard tell about with all of you, a particular pestilence and malady of nature, which requires you all to engage, yes, as you refer to it, a mask. Citizens, this is nothing new. Allow me to reflect for just a few moments. I will never forget when we were besieged by the smallpox. It came at us with a vengeance for decades, until finally, there was a vaccine. I wish it had been the ingenuity of our nation to provide it, but no, it was an Englishman, Mr. Edward Jenner, in 1798. And 3 years later, when I took the oath of office as our nation's president, I immediately promoted vaccination through our nation. In fact, as I wrote, I vaccinated 70 to 80 of my family. And by that, I mean those families, all of us that have resided here on over 5,000 acres. Not at any one place, no, but on 5 farms. I would refer to it as our inheritance because the majority of us have been born and grown up here, and so many making their way to our new nation, particularly farther west across the Blue Ridge, are discovering a population that has already been here for some time. A population essentially red, white, and black. But I think you well understand this is my inheritance, and everyone on those 5,000 acres, which I inherited from my father when he passed away all too soon. Again, a certain pestilence to which he succumbed at the age of 49 years, leaving my mother a widow to preside over the rearing of 10 children. I was but 14 at that time. I was the eldest son. I had 3 younger brothers and I had 6 sisters. We were all living at Shadwell Farm, 2 miles to the northeast from Monticello. And thank heaven, part of my father's inheritance was that little mountain, Monticello, where I would escape as a young boy and spend hours finally deciding this is where I would want to live. It was where I eventually built a small little cottage, 1 room, bedchamber, kitchen, hall, study. It was when I was 25 in the year 1768. I called it my hermitage. And there I did a lot of thinking and a lot of reading. It was not a hermitage too long, because in a few years I married a widow back east in Virginia. She had only been married for 2 years. Her husband was killed in a carriage accident near Williamsburg. She went into a widow's seclusion for 2 years, and then I began to pay her court. We were married on the first of the year 1772, and I brought her westward to my mountain area, and rest assured overnight, my hermitage became our honeymoon cottage. And she provided us a family of 6 children in a period of 10 years, but we could never understand why childbirth compromised her health. She craved sugar more than usual. Our babies weighed heavier consecutively, to the extent our last child, a little girl, Lucy Elizabeth, weighed 12 pounds. Mrs. Jefferson did not survive, but not before I promised her I would never marry again. I believe you all know that I have held to that promise, as perhaps unreasonable as it may sound. Mrs. Jefferson did not have to suffer, as I did, the death of 5 of our 6 children when they were young'un for the most part, and I can tell you no more than the complications of a simple fever. But I can tell you, when our Creator closes one door, he opens another. Bear with faith. Happiness has returned. And I hope that you have heard in this particular year of 21, I believe it is the year 21, is it not? As far northwest as it is here to the east, 1821, that I am building a true university of our Commonwealth of Virginia. This is not a collegiate curriculum. It is a universal curriculum, meaning simply, unlike a collegiate or limited and parochial curriculum, it is a universal curriculum that will continue to grow as we discover new frontiers of knowledge, as we continue to pursue science. It is the first university in the history of mankind to be founded non-secular. It is founded upon the illimitable freedom of the human mind. And our students will be provoked to be so bold as to question everything, even the existence of our Creator, because he would not have it any other way. Well, I can tell you that not only are many visiting me here at Monticello to learn more about our University of Virginia, but many are visiting here because of the anniversary we all will experience in another 5 years. That's right. I'm referring to the year 26. Remarkable, is it not? To think it will be 50 years since the birth of our nation, 50 years since our Declaration of American Independence. It is remarkable that we have lasted so long. Many thought we would not. In fact, our old enemy, England, waits for our demise every day. But we are now seeing the birth of the third generation of American citizens. 2 generations already born within these last 50 years. And so many now want to speak with me to know what it was like, because they already know. There are only 3 of us left. That is 3 of the original 56 signers of our Declaration of American Independence. They want to know the facts, and I reassure them that all 3 of our signers still living are corresponding, writing with one and the other. Mr. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Mr. John Adams of Quincy, Massachusetts, and myself, and we are writing for posterity. But the hope, of course, is that the future will read. And what all 3 of us desire the future may never forget is something that we achieved, a founding principle of our nation that we cannot hazard to forget. Remember, the ancients said man is only 1 generation removed from barbarism. That is all it takes, 1 generation to forget. And then you fall backward. And will you be able to make it up again so quickly for the succeeding generations? Never let us forget we achieved something at the very beginning that England did not want to have happen. This is well before the war began, before I picked up the pen to draft our Declaration of American Independence. I would like to ask whether anyone might reply now. Do you know what it is I am referring to? But let me take not that time at present, but later to hear your other questions. I will tell you the answer. Never forget, we brought 13 individual nations together. E pluribus unum. Citizens, how did we do that? Each one of those former colonies were nations in themselves, distant, disparate from one and the other, in the degree of religious opinion in one versus a vast difference in the other, in the degree of freeholders living in one versus the greater number of tenants living upon the freeholdings in another. There was slavery in every single one of them. But we brought it together, e pluribus unum, through the founding principle we must never forget: compromise. Compromise and resolution, not only for our common safety, not only for the common defense, but most importantly, the common good. England did not want to have that happen. She wanted to keep us distant and disparate. She wanted to keep us arguing and bickering, debating amongst ourselves. Why? Yes, common sense. Read Machiavelli. That's right. Divide and conquer. The citizens never forget is just as good common sense. To realize 2 heads are better than 1, 3 heads better than 2, 13 heads collectively are better not only for the common safety and defense, but particularly the common good. Everyone ultimately benefits. And when you see now in this year 21, we are no longer 13, but rather going on 24 states. It is remarkable that we hold this bond and keep it. This is my concern. And therefore, I hope we do not forget that when we finally took up arms and thwarted the efforts of England to subjugate us militarily, remember that she sent her troops here to subdue us, even after I personally drafted an olive branch petition, which she ignored that winter of 75 and 76. And not to forget, in the spring of 76, that in Williamsburg, Virginia, that resolution for independency was sent up to Philadelphia on behalf of all of the colonies, not only Virginia itself. And that as a result of that resolution for independence, The argument had to be supported by the presentation of the facts so that we would all understand why we were doing this. And this was the reason why President John Hancock appointed a committee of 5 men to draft our Declaration of American Independence. I do not know whether you all recall the names of that committee, but there was Mr. Adams from Massachusetts, Mr. Roger Sherman from Connecticut, Robert R. Livingston from New York, Dr. Franklin from Pennsylvania, and yes, myself from Virginia. I was the only one on the committee south of the line drawn by Messrs. Mason and Dixon. And when we met for the first time at Dr. Franklin's house, the 12th of June, 1776, all of us looked at Dr. Franklin. He was our mentor. 70 years of age. He had lived in England a good 17 years, the end of which he pleaded our cause. No, he answered, gentlemen, as I grow older, I do not care to write anything else that will receive the scrutiny of a committee. And so it was, he looked at me, and it was John Adams who suggested I write as well as anyone else, and that a Virginian ought to be at the head of this business. Why? Because it was Virginia that proposed this resolution for independency on behalf of all of us. Well, what I care to relate now as I draw my 20 minutes to a close is what I attempted to put into what President Washington referred to as our promise. What I put into our Declaration of American Independence, lest we forget. First and foremost, I put into it nothing new or original. It was not the business of the committee or he who would write our declaration to come up with anything new, but rather to reiterate what had already been written, what had already been argued and debated, in what I refer to as the elementary books of public right, the works of Aristotle, Cicero, Algernon Sidney, John Locke, those authors, their works that each and every one of you have read and reread frequently, have you not? No, I doubt you all have. But please, never forget, in 1776, many people could not even read. I realized when I took up the pen, I had to write something that could be publicly read, that could be understood by the great diversity in our population, which has ever been our greatest defense. To place before the world the common sense of the matter. That matters simply that our American Revolution was being fought on behalf of the common man, to provide the greatest good for the greatest number, to show that we had discovered in the diversity of our population that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a few booted and spurred ready to ride him, but that man holds an inalienable right in nature to burst forth from the monkish chains of ignorance and to assume the reins of self-government. Yes, that note in itself bespeaks hypocrisy in the founding of our nation, that we declare unto the world the inalienable rights of mankind, and yet in the colonies of Great Britain, in the proclaiming of a new nation, we were well aware that we were denying those inalienable rights to a great number, and who should know better than myself? And so to continue the declaration in clear and simple terms, I had to realize the necessity of shedding the lofty sophisms of these ancient authors, explain it in clear and simple terms, an expression of the American mind in 3 parts. The first part is our founding philosophy. It is the pronouncing boldly of the inalienable rights of man in those first 2 paragraphs. Now, yes, I made several drafts during the 3 days it took me to write on those 4 sheets of paper. And I can tell you that the beginning of the 2nd paragraph began, "We hold these truths to be sacred and deniable, that all men are born free and independent." Thank heaven for Dr. Franklin. When he read my first draft, he suggested immediately I need to wordsmith to make it straightforward and clear, that it would have the greatest power in the fewest words. And so it was that I altered that first line of the second paragraph to read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Everyone knew what I meant at that time, and yet I have heard that are many who proceed to it with great controversy into the future. Are indeed all men born equal? Citizens, this had been known for centuries. It had been known, lamentably, by those who were able to read, who had an education, who understood, particularly those who were familiar and read English common law, that this was the foundation of the Justinian Code of Law, the first civil body of law provided for civilized man in the Western Hemisphere. The 6th century, by Roman Emperor Justinian I, everyone is born free. Everyone comes into this world with a right to their own person and to move wherever they choose to provide their sustenance and improvement of their lives. It was nearly forgotten through the ages of the darkest ignorance. Had it not been for many a monk and many a scribe in their dark cell through the flick of a candlelight to hold on to that wisdom of the past, that it might be available for that precious invention of the modern world, the printing press. And that printing press then to disseminate this information to the greatest extent, provoking people to want to read. And what happens when people begin to read for themselves? They begin to think for themselves. This was the beginning of what is referred to as the Enlightenment of the mind of man, the recognition that light and liberty go together. It was summed up in a particular Latin phrase, sapere aude, be so bold to question everything, pursue scientific observation and reason, and realize again in common sense, he who gave us common sense gave us reason as well, to better our lives, improve our condition, and to share knowledge with our fellow man for that extent. It was that first line of the second paragraph that has been so provocative. And when many people want to ask me about it, well, I say, I tried to clarify actually something that Mr. Locke wrote. For it was Mr. Locke wrote, amongst our inalienable rights in nature is life, liberty, and the pursuit of, well, thank you for those who said the pursuit of happiness, because that's what I wrote. It was Mr. Locke who wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of, exactly, the pursuit of property. And there you have the conflict, the conundrum, the hypocrisy, if you will, in the founding of our nation, which will continue to be argued and debated by many. Is property an inalienable right? Is the claim now of the population of the territory of Missouri sound and correct? Does it have its legal foundation that Missouri may enter our nation to allow for the enslaved to continue to be the element of property, while we have admitted Maine to enter free? Well, citizens, as long as we can remind ourselves of the facts, we will be able to stand strong upon that Justinian code. To remember that, yes, the clothes upon our backs are an inherent right to pursue property. Our real estate, an inherent right to pursue and invest. But then use your common sense. Is your fellow man an inalienable right to pursue property? Do you have the right to deny your fellow man their livelihood? And again, I have known this from birth, and perhaps many of you know. I have written out in opposition to it, spoken out in opposition to it, and will continue. But now, in this year 21, that work must be upon the shoulders of future generations. as we continue to pursue our principles towards more equal and exact justice and towards a more perfect union. Never forget the first unit of property in nature, particularly validated by Justinian I, is you, the individual. You have a right to yourself. Realize we are all born free in nature, but we are born into the laws of man. And never forget, in the forming of our nation, the first nation in the history of man founded upon principle, not upon monarchy, royalty, nobility, aristocracy, landed gentry, principles of equal and exact justice. Remind yourself as well that that is our mission, to continue to change the law, argue the law, debate the law. Remind ourselves that as a child of 14 cannot wear the same clothes at the age of 40, our laws and institutions grow as we grow as a people. And realize those 830,000 square miles to the west of our Mississippi River, that territory, Louisiana, is truly our new empire of liberty. Let us staunchly plant these founding principles there. And let us proceed together with hope at the bow and fear well astern. Because I can assure you distinctly, as I've grown older, I've borne a greater faith in my fellow man and enjoy very much more the dreams of the future better than the history of the past. I say this again in the midst of the pestilence of nature, because citizens, I will tell you, 27 years later now, we still have no idea where yellow fever comes from. That yellow fever in the autumn of 1793 that took 5,000 people in Philadelphia, a city of 40,000, took 5,000 people in only 3 months. It almost took our Secretary of the Treasury, but because he had it growing up in the Indies, well, he was able to survive. But he knew, as we all did at the time, the government even had to go into quarantine and move to the little village of Germantown, northwest of Philadelphia. But citizens, it is that future that I hope will someday, though I will not live to see it, will someday know what took Mrs. Jefferson, what took 5 of our 6 children. That is your future. I thank you for the time that you have given me, and I know it's been well beyond 2 minutes and 20 minutes as well. The future is yours. I thank you, Mr. Whitney, and now I look forward to the questions and curiosities that I hope many care to hurl at me.
Well, thank you for those insights uttered in a spirit of enlightenment, Mr. Jefferson. And while viewers are formulating their questions, we have a number that are starting to come in. I'd like to just ask about a briar patch of a topic these days, and that's slavery. You know, you wrote a letter to John Holmes last year in 1820 that, quote, said this momentous question of Missouri's admission to the Union, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. Mr. Jefferson, that sounds awfully apocalyptic. What exactly did you mean was coming to the United States? Because you've just spoken with such optimism, and yet this letter has darkness hanging over it.
Ms. Whitney, I hope we never forget that the message of our Declaration of American Independence is indeed optimism. It is hope. It is finally the opportunity for mankind to rectify his hypocrisies, not for the last 10 years, not for the last 50 years or 100 years, but for centuries and millennia, to be able to do something about it. And though our Declaration of American Independence bespeaks ancient truths that all men are created equal, what I have always considered is the most important line in our Declaration is our commitment to the improvement of the condition of mankind is our commitment to pursue equal and exact justice, our commitment to form a more perfect union. It's the last line, because the last line is, if you will, our compact. I quote, "In support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." This is what this question of Missouri presents to us now. Do we ignore what we have achieved for the last 50 years? Do we allow something that we know in our heart and our conscience cannot be looked upon by our Creator as an element of property, but rather as our fellow man? Will we continue to stand boldly upon the principle of the inherent right of every individual, or allow this element of devotion to property warp and corrupt the lives of unborn millions? So yes, what I wrote does sound apocalyptic, and I can tell you this, it's not without some recourse that as this is now happening, and mind you this, it has been devised and allowed to happen through a compromise engaged by my friend, a former fellow Virginian, Senator Henry Clay, who read law with the very same law professor I read law, George Wythe of Williamsburg. And here, if this is now to happen, well, then perhaps this barbarous institution of slavery will eventually, ultimately, die out as it continues to settle westward into vast terrain. It will simply dilute itself altogether. And those now enslaved venturing westward with their masters might have more an opportunity perhaps to leave the masters. It's all of us back here in the East who are still tightly sequestered in it, sequestered for the most part by creditors. Oh, we have the opportunity to satisfy our creditors, indeed to sell our people. But I hope you've read as well that I have written, I will not sell my people, I will not sell my family. What would happen to all of us who have been so interrelated for generations? We have become a consanguinity in ourselves. I use that word in our Declaration of American Independence. It comes from the Latin word sanguine, meaning blood, the flow of blood throughout our population.
We have a number of questions coming in that are follow-up really on slavery. And I think one of the most interesting, Mr. Jefferson, is that you made a proposal, did you not, in the House of Burgesses, or when you were a young delegate, actually to want to emancipate the slaves and at the same time to provide them with training, education, schooling, so that they would not just be set loose in the marketplace, but would have the means by which they could survive in the country.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And it almost may sound like excuses, if you will, to mention that I have endeavored to do just that at Monticello Farm, at Tufton Farm, at Pantops Farm, Lego, at Poplar Forest, to be able to provide a preparation as we can begin to ratify new laws for the eventual emancipation of those who have been enslaved for generations. For generations. This has not happened overnight. And I fear, as I have written as well, far too many instances of hostilities and aggressions against these people for so very long will not be easily forgotten by them. We began to realize this in the 1740s and 1750s. And yes, having the privilege of an education simply because my family had the means enabled me to better understand this and to be able to pursue opportunities that can draw it eventually to a close. So when I was 26 years old, elected to the old Virginia House of Burgesses, took my seat in Williamsburg, in the Capitol there, that spring of 1769, I actually stood to second the motion. It was proposed by Mr. Oh my heavens, I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman who first proposed that. Carter, I believe it was Robert Carter, and I second the motion. And then later, you may know, in drafting the Some Review of the Rights of British America that was printed in Williamsburg the summer of 1774, I wrote, in fact, if you can find a copy, they're still about on the bottom of page 16, continuing to the top of 17, I quote, "For the most trifling reasons, and sometimes for no conceivable reason at all, His Majesty has denied laws of the most salutary tendency. The abolition of domestic slavery is the general desire of those colonies in which it first began. But previous to the freeing of the slaves we have, it is necessary to cease any further importation. And yet our repeated attempts to effect that by prohibitions, by petitions, by duties, which might amount to a prohibition, have continually received His Majesty's negative." I could go on. I could talk about, if you will, the clause I had in our declaration amongst our grievances that was struck out in order to maintain political unanimity. And yet that second paragraph is what enables us to continue to argue this subject in particular. When we were victorious and our Congress then met in Annapolis, the spring of 1784, I was appointed to a committee to report on the Northwest Territories, meaning not only the Ohio, but westward into Indiana, into Illinois and Michigan, and chaired that committee, suggesting 5 requisites by which we could admit these territories to our nation as new states. Firstly, every territory becoming a state of our union will forever remain a state of our union. Secondly, every territory becoming a state in our union will have its government in Republican forms, as the other states, the federal government. Thirdly, every territory becoming a state of our union will have a portion of the national debt apportioned on it as it can pay in time. So therefore, you see, 1784, I had no idea, nor would I have ever suffered the Hamiltonian plan of an assumption bill, a federal government assuming all those debts and levying them equally upon all the states. Fourth, no one holding any hereditary title will be admitted a citizen of our nation. And fifth, to this question, Mr. Whitney, by the year 1800 of the Christian era, there shall no longer be any involuntary servitude in any of the states or the territories annexed to them. That was put up to vote in our Congress, and it lost by 1. It is still said that the delegate from New Jersey was home-ill that day. I wrote that evening, "On this day, the heavens clouded over our young nation and the destinies of unborn millions were made." It was so close, it could not be forgotten, but not before I was commissioned to sail to France and succeed Dr. Franklin. As I sailed, they then created the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 out of that report. They then further created the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 to be adhered to our new Constitution. And this is precisely the argument, the foundation of the argument that we are arguing this year in the beginning of 1821 and will continue to be argued. So I hope we do not forget the history that is so necessary to remind us of our continuing efforts to provide a resolution and a compromise upon this very important subject.
We have 2 viewers who are asking about the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. Why is that so important to your legacy?
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank those and yourself for reiterating it and mentioning it correctly. It is the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. It emanates from the bill for religious freedom. That title emanating from the committee formed in the old Virginia House of Burgesses, titled the Committee for Religion. That committee was formed in 1769 to receive the growing number of petitions being put forth by the growing number of dissenters coming into Virginia. That is, those who dissented from the Church of England. Because in Virginia and the majority of our sister colonies, we were not only governed by the British monarchy, we were governed by their church. Yes, you were free to hold an opinion as you choose, but you had to pay a tax to the support of the Church of England. You had to attend the Church of England at least 12 Sundays a year, on the average, one Sunday a month. If you wanted to marry, you had to purchase a marriage license from the Church of England. Now, if you dissented from any of these laws, you were fined. And if you refused to pay your fine, you were thrown to jail. Good heavens, I remember before the war began, the jails in Virginia were becoming filled with Baptists. They had come down from the north preaching freedom for religion. Now, this is essential to remember because it is the freedom for the human mind. That is exactly what that bill protects and defends. It is exactly the founding principle of our University of Virginia, the illimitable freedom of the human mind to hold your opinion upon religion as you choose, or hold no opinion upon the subject as you choose. That still preserves the freedom of your mind. And this is why, when I answered the coterie of Baptist preachers from Danbury, Connecticut, they wrote me during the first 1 or 2 years of my first administration as president. They were concerned that in Connecticut, they were still subjected to the Constitution of Connecticut, which was allied with the Congregationalist Church. And I replied to them, bear with patience until the Constitution of the Connecticut is altered to follow our Constitution, which is the law of the land. And then I stated clearly, rest assured, no one more than myself would rather see a great wall of separation be built between church and state. The semantics is so necessary to understand that principle of freedom for religion. This is not a separation of church and state, which can easily imply, particularly by political twistification, a separating of religion from our lives, from the lives of those we elect to government. No, this is a separation between the civil authority and the ecclesiastical authorities, allowing more freedom for each to pursue their duty. Is it the duty of the civil authority to dictate religious opinion? I think we know not. That's why so many of us and our ancestors sought an asylum here. To worship freely, escape those kingdoms that will want to coerce one to furnish contributions of money to a religion or religious opinion they disbelieve. No, and the ecclesiastical authorities are there free and separate in order to be protected in their duty, the administration of the soul, and to do good. The only duty of civil authority is simply to protect people from injury by one and the other. That is, all the acts of laws and government attend to actions that are harmful and oppressive, but otherwise to leave an individual free to carry his opinion upon religion as he chooses.
We have a lot of questions, not about Mr. Hamilton, which you would expect, because in our part of the Republic, Hamilton has been much discussed. I don't know if that's gotten back to you back in Monticello, but here everybody's talking about Hamilton. However, most of the people who are with us this evening want to know more about your relationship with John Adams. And maybe it's because it appears that you have a bust. I can't quite see it really well, but a bust of John Adams to your right behind you.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes, sir. So they want to know about your relationship, your friendship with John Adams, but also Dr. Paul Farr, one of our distinguished viewers, is asking specifically, did you, if you and John Adams had been at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, would the Constitution as we know it today have been different, especially in light of all your work on the Northwest Ordinances? Great questions.
That is a very great question. And of course, it's hypothetical, but I will tell you this, having had the opportunity to continue to correspond with Mr. Adams when he sailed to England to take up his commission as Minister Plenipotentiary at the court of King George. And as I continued to correspond with Mr. James Madison, who was very influential in that Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, I think all three of us came together in a common recognition that though I thought the Articles of Confederation were a venerable fabric, they ought not to be tampered with, that yes, finally, when we were able to read Mr. Madison's idea of a constitution, a strengthening of the government, a more efficient government, well, I explained it, and it was the same in Mr. Adams' mind. It is captivating. It is the shortest document of its kind in human history, creating a government to check its own power. And of the three particular branches, the most influential is the legislative branch. That branch elected by the people. That is our founding principle, government of, by, and for the people. Now, Mr. Adams, always being an inherent and a supporter of the inalienable rights of man, he would agree, as I certainly agreed, that as captivating as the Constitution certainly is, it lacks something. It lacks something very, very necessary. And Mr. Madison did not essentially and initially desire this. He knew about it. He certainly understood what it might have attendant to it. But it was myself, rather than Mr. Adams, who wrote Mr. Madison, who complimented our Constitution in its new form. But I said it needs something that will keep it in the hands of the people. What it needs is a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights is what all people upon this globe are entitled to against any government upon the globe. Mr. Madison believed that it was not necessary. He believed that all of the rights are inferred in the Constitution. He worried that when we begin to enumerate these rights, where do we begin? Where do we end? And consider the great argument even over that, how many we should enumerate and what they ought to be. Well, the answer Mr. Adams certainly understood as I did. And I wrote to Mr. Madison, do you mean to say then we will rest on inference upon such an important subject as the inalienable rights of man? You see, what worried Mr. Madison was the argument, the contest. But we're going to have that argument and contest far more. There will be far more vitriol, far more deceit, far more twistification if you simply rest on inference. And who will always have the last word? That particular government in power. Now, I can well understand the gentleman's question, because in the late 1790s, did not President Adams himself take it upon his administration to even deny that First Amendment, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly? Did he not deny in the Alien Acts as well, immigrants to come here and to live here freely, to engage their own livelihood if we have some dispute or disagreement with the nation from which they came? And those Alien and Sedition Acts were what I greatly protested, and so did Mr. Madison. Mr. Adams never forgot that. And Mr. Adams knew well that you could not make a permanent law to this. It was politics, because they are acts, not law. And they were meant to expire. There was a sunset clause for them to expire on the 3rd day of March, 1801, the day before the next presidential inauguration. This so as to secure President Adams' administration. That's why Mr. Madison wrote the Virginia resolutions, and I wrote the Kentucky resolutions as a very, very profound neglect of the right of the people to be heard in a government of, by, and for the people. So I'm happy to say that this is all in the past. I have made this statement earlier, and looking forward to the dreams of the future. Mr. Adams and I have reconvened a most engaging correspondence. We're writing for the future, and yes, every once in a while we might bite at one and the other, bringing up those Alien and Sedition Acts. But thank heaven they were finally reconciled, and thank heaven Mr. Adams and myself and Mr. Madison and current President Monroe, President-elect, he will be inaugurated this coming March the 4th, 21. Thank heaven we continue to maintain our union.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jefferson. By your leave, we're now going to transition to part 2 of this evening's program. We're going to enter, as it were, a time machine and travel 200 years to the present moment and speak to the most remarkable doppelganger there ever was, William David Barker. Thank you so much, Bill, for that splendid interpretation of Thomas Jefferson. We at the Ford Presidential Foundation and Museum and at the Hauenstein Center have been having you come back to this part of the country for more than 15 years now, and you never disappoint, my friend. And I know there are going to be questions our viewers will want to ask you, because you're also a Shakespearean actor and an early American historian in your own right. And so to get started, please tell us a little bit about yourself, especially how you became the world's foremost interpreter of Thomas Jefferson over the past 4 decades now, performing in the White House, the US Capitol, the Palace of Versailles, Colonial Williamsburg, and of course, Monticello.
Well, thank you, Gleaves, and thank everyone for this opportunity to speak once more with all my friends out west, as we like to say in Virginia, Western Virginia, and to continue to discuss age-old questions, arguments, debates that are still so much with us today. And realizing it is our history that gives us that validation, that right to continue to argue this and discuss it. I was fortunate to be born, let me see, a generation behind. I had much older parents. My father was born in 1894, and he was 61 when I was born, and I'm the eldest of 3 boys. My mother was born in 1910. They were both born in 2 completely different demographics. My father was born on an old family farm in North Carolina that had been settled in 1763. He was born in the same house as was his great-great-great-grandfather. My mother's family had been in Philadelphia since the mid-1770s. So I grew up hearing the history they related. I particularly grew up in visiting our family in Virginia, North Carolina, with a generation who were born in the 1870s, the 1880s, even Civil War widows who were born in the 1860s. And when they talked about the war, it was not World War II or World War I. They were still talking about the American Civil War. And the thing that I will never forget is the disagreements that were still going on within the family over the purpose of that war. That society back then were so divided as well. They were divided. In fact, in my great-grandfather's family, there were 11 children. There were actually 9 boys and 2 girls. 4 of those boys became Methodist preachers and went up north to live. The other 4 stayed behind and entered the Confederacy. So that experience brought me intimately into the curiosities of history. And then, yes, I enjoyed relating that theatrically. I loved history plays. And in elementary school, I was usually chosen to be the narrator in a history play. And then, as you mentioned, Shakespeare, good heavens, what wonderful, wonderful history within that. Some of it written merely for the buck. I'm referring to Richard III, as modern evidence is just brought to light with the discovery of his body in Leicester. But even so, the play's the thing, as we know, Mr. Shakespeare said. And furthermore, I have been privileged to have psychology teachers say, you know, despite all our modern discoveries and everything, it still is all in Shakespeare. It is all in Shakespeare. And so this sort of thing cannot help but inspire, provide energy to simply storytell. And you mentioned Hamilton. What a marvelous, marvelous way to relate history. The number of young children that we encounter every day at Monticello who are familiar with that musical and ask Mr. Jefferson questions about how he got along with General Hamilton, and Jefferson having the opportunity to say, well, please do not misinterpret that we hated one and the other. On the contrary, we knew exactly where one and the other stood. These are ancient arguments. They have always existed and will continue to do so. But do not forget that in the midst of our differences of opinion, we never had a difference of principle. And we compromised together with the Assumption Bill and the placement of our nation's capital in Washington. We compromised on the founding the Coast Guard together. We compromised on stabilizing the value of money in all our states. Although Mr. Jefferson was not in favor of a standing army that Hamilton proposed in times of peace, he compromised. He had to reconcile and accepted that, so long as Hamilton would accept a well-educated military officer corps. And so he lived to see Jefferson commission our military academy, founding West Point, and the first school of engineering, coincidentally. And furthermore, upon that subject, and again, what beautiful theater, and to show Mr. Jefferson very much as a devotee of theater, and particularly Shakespeare, in the entrance hall of Monticello, Jefferson placed a bust of himself, which is on the right as you enter into the entrance hall, and then you look to the left and there is a bust of General Hamilton. When people would enter and look back and forth, if Jefferson was there, he would say, yes, there the two of us will gaze across at one and the other in opposition throughout death as we have been in life. So these theatrics, this element of portraying history, enacting history, has always been very much a part of what I have enjoyed doing.
And as I recall, just reading a brief description of how President Biden has put up some of the artwork, the portraiture in the Oval Office, as I recall, the theme of Jefferson and Hamilton still with each other is even right behind, isn't it on one of the walls of the Oval Office, is it not?
Yes, in front of the Resolute desk is the fireplace, and over the fireplace centered is a portrait of George Washington. And then to the right, as you're looking at the portrait of Washington, is a portrait of Thomas Jefferson. And to the left, as you're looking at the portrait of Washington, is a portrait of Alexander Hamilton. Absolutely.
We've got some really good questions also coming. It's a little bit more philosophical, which would be temperamental, or a good temperament fit for both Bill Barker and Thomas Jefferson, I think. Ashley Godden and others are asking how, the founders seem to do a pretty good job of balancing freedom and order. How do you think we're doing today with that balancing act?
That's a wonderful question.
Wonderful question.
Mr. Jefferson was familiar with a Scottish jurist. I hope I'm not forgetting his name, but I believe the name was James Wilson. I think it was the same name as the Pennsylvania delegate in the Continental Congress. And James Wilson wrote about law and society, and he wrote some very profound statements. Manners are law. Law are simply good manners. And in Jefferson's society, and throughout the majority of the population into which he was born, and across the globe, there was the element of common decency, a respect of how to treat another individual, the idea of a gentleman, the idea of a lady. You see it in letters of introduction. You see it when you realize you're living in a 4-mile-an-hour world, and as you venture west into the wilderness, who can you trust? How are you to be trusted by others, let alone trust people? So I think a lot of what we are contending with, and a lot of losing the navigation of a civil society, is simply because of losing a sense of decorum and good manners and common decency. I don't want to point fingers, but I think we all know how this has gradually occurred over the last several years, to the point where we almost become numb to what may be said publicly through the media. And that goes for a number of people, and how they will act if they are contested or contended with. And we've got to do something about that, because civilization is manners, is simply good manners. The Romans said, manners make the man. That's no different in this modern world. This is what we teach our children, what we want our children to grow up with. And the simple reason why? Because you are more comfortable with people of good manners and respect. You feel more secure. You feel more ready to share interesting subjects and to have discussions, to pursue the art of conversation. So that's my take on it. And I say that from portraying Mr. Jefferson now from nearly 40 years, and being able to have conversations with John Meacham, conversations with Gordon Wood, you know, who refer to Thomas Jefferson as having remarkably good manners, eyewitness accounts of his exceptionally good manners. And this was the same with Washington and Adams, Madison, Hamilton. Oh my heavens, Hamilton was charming, absolutely charming, as we well know from that musical. So that's my comment upon that.
Very good. And we have a couple of other students who've written in a very similar vein. They would like you to comment on whether, in historical perspective, since you are a historian, you have studied this, are politics rougher today than it was during the founding era? And have certain forces today been at work, whether it's social media or, talk radio or whatever it is, exacerbated to a degree that the founders could never have anticipated? And then this last, and this will be our last question, if you could combine that with Benjamin Franklin's famous utterance outside of Independence Hall, what have you left us with? And, he said something to the effect, well, yep, we've given you a republic if you can keep it. So what do we do? Our students want to know in this question, what do we do to keep our republic and move forward? Great question.
Wonderful question. Does the media have something to do with it? Yes, but no more to do with it, the political contentions and the vitriol and the heresies and the twistifications of the facts, than the media had something to do with it in the presidential elections of 1796 and 1800. The difference is there's simply more of it today. There's a greater diversity of it, more choice as to which media you choose to follow. And this is something that, it was a bug in Jefferson's side. A thorn, he couldn't stand it. He even suggested that news writers be quelled or arrested. And yet he realized this is an inherent right. And finally, he simply had to stand upon the principle where it left to me to decide whether we should have this nation with a government and no newspapers, or have this nation with newspapers and no government. Well, then I would not hesitate a moment but to accept the latter, because it's the people who have to be the judge of what they choose to read. And he would say, why would any American citizen choose to read only what they want to read without reading the opposite opinion, and then make up their mind for what is best for everyone, for the nation? So yes, our political contentions are amplified more than they have ever been. But happily, and I say this knocking on wood, we do not have a senator in our Senate start screaming and yelling and espousing expletive deleted against another senator, running after him and attacking him with fire tongs or his walking stick, as happened to Charles Sumner. A very curious juxtaposition, coincidentally, with those films taken of the inside of the Capitol on January 6th. One of the biggest, most provocative photographs is there with that painting of Sumner in the background. So we don't have senators spitting on another senator and this sort of thing, which occurred. But then we never had a January 6th before either. This is part of truly who we are with respect to the American experiment. But what is the common denominator in the opinion of those of our past and should remain the common denominator today as far as the American experiment? Government of, by, and for the people. So as Jefferson said, should you discover anyone in office to be dishonorable, dishonest, to be corrupt, unvirtuous, will they not be so in any walk of life? And if you condone it there, then you will elect it to office. Cicero, people will get the government they deserve. In other words, the government is the reflection of the people. This is the result of monarchy too. That's why finally, you know, in our colonies, and John Locke and many others during the Enlightenment were helping people to understand, as Locke said, no government anywhere at any time will long survive unless it recognizes it receives its just power to govern from the governed, from the people. As a school child could understand, if there are no people, then a government governs over nobody. So where does it begin? It begins with us. It begins with the wonderful opportunity to go to school, to learn, to pursue education. And you know what? It's more than education. It's learning. That's what it is. It's the essence of learning. We're always too quick to assume, well, education can be somewhat of an indoctrination. Wait a minute, not if you're learning, not if you're expressing ideas and speaking with one and the other, arguing and debating ideas. That's learning. That's coming to a common consensus of things, a consensus by which we can move forward. Will there still remain differences? Of course, but we can proceed, we can go on. So it begins with the people. And remember too, in the presidential election of 1820, we have 23 states secured. We're going to admit Missouri in March of 1821, but the franchise in Missouri, the territory of Missouri, is able to vote in the presidential election of 1820. Now, here's the point. What is that franchise? Well, I cannot see all of you out there, but I can tell you who it was not. It was not the woman. Woman had no vote, no voice in government. It was not the person of color. And that not only means those who were enslaved, it means mulattoes, it means the natives of this land, it means anyone of a particular hue from a foreign land who has every right to come here and better their condition. No vote, no voice. It was not the white male, 21 years of age or older, who did not hold property. It was not the white male, 21 years of age or older, who held property, but was mortgaged, because it was not their property. It belonged to their creditor. And imagine your creditor could be a wealthy woman of color. No matter your wealth, you had no vote, no voice. So for the majority of our 23, there were one or two exceptions in New York and Pennsylvania, but for the majority of 23 states going on 24 states, the only one who could vote in a presidential election or any election was the white male freeholder, 21 years of age or older. Now consider, will that continue to be the franchise in 30 years, 40 years, the 1850s, the 1860s? There was no universal system of education during that time. And that is something that Mr. Jefferson and many others worked to achieve in their lifetimes. Jefferson began when he was only 30 years old to suggest the opportunity for the poor as well as the wealthy and the female as well as the male to go to school. It was voted down and continued to be voted down. And so this is the reason why finally he says, well, They're not going to be able to stop a University of Virginia. And he and many others began to pursue that. So again, Gleaves and everyone, I think the importance of what we've been doing tonight and welcoming further differences of opinion, but welcoming further study of history helps us better to remember where we were in order to have a better idea of where we are and how we can continue to move forward together in this remarkable American experiment. Jefferson referred to it as the world's best hope. That's why the odds of the world are upon us.
Good words. Thank you, Bill Barker, for coming to us as yourself, a renowned thespian and a serious historian in your own right. And as a peerless Thomas Jefferson, may you continue to educate and enlighten for many years. I know we could listen to you all night. You just are always a wealth of insight. We sure look forward to having you back. Thanks also to our many viewers and contributors who make this and other outstanding programs possible, whether you're a friend of Ford or you're a member of the Hauenstein Circle. We appreciate all that you do to make our good work possible. Thank you and good night.
Good night all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barker and Gleaves, for that probing discussion. And thank you to everybody who submitted questions tonight. And sorry for those of you that submitted questions that we didn't get to. We really appreciate it. After this meeting ends, a link will pop open with a survey for this evening's event. Please fill that out and let us know what you thought of the event and give us feedback for future events as well. Nominations and applications for the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy close on Monday, February 22nd in just a couple of days. And if you are a student or you know a student who is interested, you can find more information on our website at gvsu.edu/HC. And don't forget to join us on Thursday, March 18th at 7 p.m. for a celebration of our namesake, Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein, and what would have been his 109th birthday. We're going to be joined by historian David Eisenhower, who's joining us to share stories from his grandfather, then General Eisenhower, and insights into how the intelligence efforts helped win the Second World War. Once again, thank you all for joining us this evening and have a great night.